the traditional owners of the country that we meet on today, the Kaurna people. So in the Cape York Land Council Native Title Rep Body region, there was a claim filed in 2014 that covered almost all of the land in that region that had not already been determined or was at that time already under claim and on track to get a determination very shortly afterwards, which is about 55% of the Rep Body region. The claim that resulted goes by the name Cape York United No. 1 claim. In 2015, 8 consultant anthropologists were engaged to report on regions within the claim, and I was one of them reporting on the southeastern part of the claim area. Now, I won't go into the history of how the court's mediation of the claim initially fared, but suffice to say, it took 6 years before a process was agreed with the state and the court by which native title holding group definitions and boundaries within each of the anthropologist research regions were defined by agreement within and between neighbouring groups. And the intention and the reality as it emerged was that determinations would progressively be carved out of the larger claim area over time. So I was a consultant back at that time, but in 2020, incidentally, I took on the job of the manager of anthropology at the Land Council. So since November 2021, we have been having consent determinations approximately every 6 months or so, usually multiple consent determinations each 6 months. So the process as set out in the agreement between the court and the state and the Land Council, in the lead up to the authorisation and then determination of a claim area, involves an intense period of meetings among and between groups. Immediately prior to the authorisation meeting is a pre-authorisation meeting that's supposed to ensure that everybody is fully across the issues so as to allow for the actual authorisation meeting to essentially be a formality, because everyone understands and agrees to the proposed outcome before the day of the actual authorisation. These detailed timetables are intensively managed by the court in relation to each of the proposed determination areas. At a pre-authorisation meeting for one of the groups that was timetabled to be among the earliest determinations, an individual attended who hadn't previously been involved in any part of the claim work. There was a dispute within this group in relation to 3 small areas of land within the proposed determination area, a dispute over who holds rights in those areas and how the native title holding groups should be defined by reference to Aboriginal ancestors. Within the proposed native title holding group, there was a clear majority on one side of the arguments. The Land Council's lawyers proposed that this was what they called an intramural dispute, and while the native title determination would not necessarily resolve the dispute, they recommended that they should proceed to determination and then get assistance to attempt to get a mediated agreement between the disputing parties post-determination. So this individual I referred to spoke at that pre-authorisation meeting and encouraged the group not to proceed with authorisation. He spoke to the Land Council staff and consultants at the meeting, purporting to speak on behalf of the majority faction of the group to say, in effect, we don't want native title, we want sovereignty instead. The extent of support for his position was not entirely clear at that meeting. It was all pretty chaotic. And the decision was made to proceed with the scheduled authorisation meeting that had been timetabled by the court a few weeks later. Following that meeting, this individual engaged a lawyer who happened to have had absolutely no previous experience working in native title. At the authorisation meeting, the claim group member that I referred to had assembled sufficient numbers to vote down the proposed authorisation resolutions. Following that meeting, he and some of his immediate family members then made application to the court to be joined as respondent parties. At the interlocutory hearing, his lawyer argued to the court that they should be joined because this was not a simple matter of intramural dispute, but instead this group did not want a determination of native title at all. The judge joined one of the family members as a respondent and put their part of the claim area, in her words, to the back of the queue. Now, I can't go into correspondence between this individual and the Land Council, obviously, And I don't want to reveal his identity, as this is a matter that's still in progress. But this individual has published various missives on the internet in which he has declared himself Attorney General and Foreign Affairs Minister of a particular nation named by reference to a language name. He's also referred to himself as Ambassador of the Sovereign Yidinji government. Now, the Sovereign Yidinji government was established in 2014 by former SBS journalist, formerly known as Jeremy Geyer, now known as Muramu Woolabara Yidinji. In recent times, he has been styling himself as Saint Muramu of Woolabara. He made the news in 2015 when he issued his own number plates and driver's license and got arrested. And he continues to prolifically publish on the internet and gets occasional attention in the mainstream media. 2019, there was a write-up in the New York Times. In the lead up to the voice referendum, he was interviewed by Andrew Bolt, presumably trying to scare people as to what the future might look like if the referendum got up. Now, this fellow's been influential in the North Queensland region, and he's got a wide network of people that pay close attention to what he does. He's got a professionally produced website. He's got cryptocurrency. You can apply for citizenship of his nation. I encourage people to go and have a look. It really looks quite sophisticated. Other people have clearly followed his example in declaring themselves ministers of state in their respective regions, nations. And he's also appointed a few other ambassadors of the Sovereign Yidinji government in various places, including some in Cape York. I was given a letter written by a completely different individual to his local council, in which he used an Aboriginal language name that I hadn't seen him use before, and the name of one of his great-grandfathers, followed by Junior. And in the letter he said he was, I quote, "from the House of Yeri, on behalf of his family, sovereign custodians, direct lineage of Gumukudin Undiyambu in the Kingdom of Oyunqui." And he notified the council that it must seek consent from him in relation to any land business dealings. He concludes his letter by saying, and again I quote, "As confirmed in the Holy Bible, a direction to all human beings from the Almighty Creator of the universe, heaven and earth, Jehovah, God," at Proverbs 22:28, quote, "remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set." In each of these instances, there's a coat of arms with traditional totemic references embedded within it. Now, that last instance that I mentioned is a person who has been and continues to be actively involved in native title claims. He's given evidence in a native title trial. He's an active member of more than one PBC, including the one that covers the region of the council in which he's just written to. Now, I'm sure most, if not all of you in this room have come across similar such materials, pretty widespread around Australia. Pascal Taplin and some colleagues have recently published a paper in Tarja, and Pascal gave a paper at the recent AAS conference in Sydney last year, in which she gives many further examples. And Pascal's interested to trace some of the influences of the international sovereign citizens, what she calls super conspiracy movement, on the discourses of Australian Indigenous sovereignty. Pascal recommends countering the mis and disinformation circulating in these super conspiracy networks with factual information. For example, by pushing back when people make wildly inaccurate assertions at native title meetings. I don't intend what I have to say to be a polemic against Pascal's arguments, and there are certainly some circumstances where that might be effective. But I think it's also helpful to try to comprehend what the attraction of this type of sovereignty discourse might be. When I first encountered these statements and assertions, what was immediately striking was the way in which people were using symbolic resources that are emblematic of the nation state to contest their incorporation within the Australian nation state. The coat of arms and the self-appointment to ministries of government of their own nation being obvious examples of this. It also seems to me that there are similarities to materials that I came across when I was doing my PhD fieldwork on the south coast of Papua New Guinea, immediately adjacent to Torres Strait. And I have to confess here to over-promising in my abstract. I said I'd look at the anthropological literature on Melanesian millenarian movements, and I'm not going to have time to do that today. But I'm going to just briefly refer to some of my own materials and leave that broader literature for another day. So my research was focused on the practical interpretation of the word traditional in the administration of the Australia-PNG border, where a treaty between the two countries provides that people with traditional and customary associations on the other side of the border can cross to the other side to engage in traditional activities without needing passports and visas. And the context at that time was Australia had then recently significantly restricted who it was allowing to cross the border. The village people on the PNG side of the border have been disempowered through colonisation and further through decolonisation, and they're acutely conscious of their marginalisation. Like many others in Melanesian, they've developed their traditional mythology to incorporate the colonisers and the Western-dominated post-colonial geopolitical order in which they place themselves at the centre of the universe, posit their current circumstance as morally unjust, and predict a reversal of the fortunes in which the true order will be restored. In the course of that research, I was given several documents in which people had set down how they envisaged this happening, including a copy of a letter that had been sent to the Queen, which had a flag, which was a picture of a wallaby across a blue and green background to represent the new nation that would incorporate the south coast of PNG, Torres Strait and Cape York, and various documents of a similar kind. In a 2009 Australian Senate inquiry into the border administration, evidence was given by another group from an area close by who have been prohibited from crossing the border. They do not acknowledge, they said this to the senators in the inquiry, we do not acknowledge the Australian government as having legitimate sovereign right to prevent us from doing so. Now, questions about this concept of sovereignty are intrinsic to the concept of native title. The legal doctrine that the Crown has sovereign power, including the radical title over the entire continent of Australia, underpins the native title regime within which we work. Justice Brennan's Mabo judgment briefly considers the question of whether the acquisition of sovereignty by the British Crown was legitimate, but he recites a principle that had previously been enunciated by the High Court, that, and I quote, the acquisition of territory by a sovereign state for the first time is an act of state which cannot be challenged, controlled, or interfered with by the courts of that state. And his judgment abides by that principle. The leading judgment in the High Court's Yordi Order decision makes extensive reference to the date of acquisition of sovereignty in its consideration of the meaning traditional. And since that time, references to pre-sovereignty and post-sovereignty are commonplace in native title anthropology reports deriving from the practice of lawyers using this terminology in the terms of reference that they put to us. The question of whether sovereignty was legitimately acquired in accordance with international law has been questioned by some legal scholars, and in my reading of that literature, there is a very good argument to say it was not. The Black Sovereign movement has emerged that certainly asserts that it was not, and that movement was given some prominence in the Voice to Parliament referendum debates. While their position was generally to oppose the Voice referendum, it should be recalled that the Uluru Statement from the Heart, from which the idea derived, refers in its first sentence to, I quote, the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands. But then it goes on to say that this sovereignty, quote, has never been ceded or extinguished, and it goes on and then makes a concession to colonisation by recognising that, quote, it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. Recognition that sovereignty was never ceded is a commonly used phrase in assertions of Indigenous identity, just as the term First Nations people has recently become preferred by many, even most people, in reference to what were called Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, Indigenous Australian people. And I don't think this is mere coincidence that these things are happening at the same time. Now, I'm afraid I haven't said a lot about what this means in practice for native title anthropology. We can't avoid the fact that we are participating in a legal process that depends for its legitimacy on the doctrine that sovereignty was legally acquired by the British Crown. But I would say that this should be recognised only in a pragmatic sense, and that we should take the critiques that are implicit and explicit in this discourse of sovereignty seriously. I'm running out of time, but I won't be long.
No, I'm short too.
Okay. And where I think this can take us in terms of the analysis of the millenarian anthropology of Melanesian millenarianism is that earlier anthropological understandings of what was called cargo cults developed so that we came to appreciate that these were actually quite profound critiques of the geopolitical order by which people have been marginalised. Whereas in bringing the Mabo case, the assertion of native title constituted resistance to the established order, in the meantime, as native title has been seen to not live up to the revolutionary aspirations that people hold, and it is in offering this millenarian potential that the sovereignty discourse appeals. Not to despair. Discussions that we, not me personally, but other people at the Land Council have had with the group in the Cape York United claim that I referred to earlier, whose lawyer told the court that they didn't want native title, have involved explaining that the LUA that they currently have with the council, which provides them with substantial authority in relation to future acts, and which they very much support, derives from their native title rights. I think careful discussion away from the heat of the disputed areas seems to have resulted in people deciding that they actually probably do want native title after all. There seems to me to be room to argue the case for a pragmatic pursuit of native title recognition without insisting on the legitimacy of the British acquisition of sovereignty, and to leave discursive space open to continue that discussion. And I'm going to just add one more thing. I haven't got time, but Catherine said I've got time, so I'll take your time.
Go on.
My partner is from West Papua, and I see a lot of West Papuans, and a lot of them are refugees, and they consider themselves to be living in exile until they can return to an independent West Papua. And among them, there are a lot of people who have called themselves foreign affairs minister, attorney general, prime minister of a government in exile. And they're widely criticised by many other West Papuans for doing so, for the grandiosity of their assertions and for the assumption that they make. But their response is usually to say, well, look at what happened in East Timor. The East Timor people were a government in exile. They were living in a fantasy land that you say could never come about, but now they're the government of East Timor. That's all I'll say.